The pathways approach is about what we describe as broadening out and opening up the array of possible futures, be that food futures or health futures or water futures. We've seen that in the maize sector in Africa, where the demand for maize continues to grow, and that's clear. But what we're also seeing is that when people are exposed to alternatives and they start tasting these things and they see the benefits, then there is a growing demand for it. And certainly the motorway, get rid of the motorway. We're saying the motorway is there, but by taking some of the resources, some of those investments, and putting them elsewhere, you can get greater impact at scale for a larger number of people that may be more equitable, that may be more sustainable in terms of the resources, and may be more climate resilient in the long run.
Welcome to the Well Lab show, where we try to learn more about water, environment, land, and livelihoods. I'm Pavan Srinath. Every 2 weeks, we'll sit with some of our colleagues at Well Labs or talk to some of our wonderful partners and learn more about the science, the systems, and the stories around complex environmental and social issues. Let's get started. Over to my colleague Arjuna Srinidhi for this show.
Welcome, John. We've had an eventful 10 days with discussions on our ongoing research project, Clarity, that has case studies in Africa and in India. We'll come to some of that in a bit, but I want to begin by asking you about pathways approaches. And the reason I want to start with this is we often use some of these terms like trajectories, scenarios, pathways in a very interchangeable manner. But specifically, when we are talking about building climate resilience, how would you describe a pathways approach to building climate resilience, and how would it be different from another approach to tackling a development or a climate-related challenge?
Well, thank you, Arjuna. It's a pleasure to be here. And I've certainly enjoyed the last 10 days because we've been exploring these concepts, talking about their application in India, in East and West Africa. And it's building on a body of work that's been developed over the last 15 years or so, perhaps even more in some respects. But our pathways approach that we're employing in Clarity and some other research really grows out of work in science and technology studies and development studies, and merging these together to understand how we can move beyond the lock-in to certain dominant development pathways and practices that restrict opportunities, say, for poor people, marginal groups, but also may be unsustainable in many respects, that may generate benefits for certain groups in the short term, but often have longer-term environmental consequences and impacts on poor people. And what we've tried to do with our pathways approach, and this has emerged out of work at the University of Sussex and IDS in the UK, is to combine our understanding of the politics of knowledge about how different individuals in a complex system, be that a water system or a health system or an agricultural system, how they frame the problem that they're encountering or the development challenge they may face, and how we may create these storylines, or what we call narratives, of how change happens and who benefits and who doesn't and why in a particular context. So the pathways approach is about what we describe as broadening out and opening up the array of possible futures, be that food futures or health futures or water futures. And in that way, it's taking forward the idea of moving beyond this lock-in to the dominant development pathway that may channel a lot of investment, a lot of resources, be supported by policy and practice, and, as I say, benefit some but not others. And what we're trying to do is recognize what are the existing pathways, the kind of route that we're on at the moment, the main motorway, versus some of the emerging or aspirational alternatives that may be more equitable, more sustainable, more climate resilient, to come back to that point. And so what we're trying to do with this pathways approach is broaden out and open up that array of existing and possible pathways and discuss what does it take to pursue each of these, recognizing that they're not independent, that they co-evolve, that one affects the other. And certainly the dominant pathway will have effects on these other emerging and aspirational pathways. But we recognize that those alternatives may be potentially more sustainable in the long run, more climate resilient. And what we're trying to do is have a conversation among different stakeholders in a complex system to get their views of how they frame the problem, how they create those storylines of possible futures, and then think through the consequences of choosing these array of options of who benefits, who doesn't, and why. And then talk through in social terms, in technological terms, and environmental terms, how each of these may play out, and think about the consequences of the choices for the future. It's not to say that we will follow a particular pathway necessarily, or that it will be a singular pathway. We're not seeking the optimal pathway, because there is no such thing. But recognize that they co-evolve and they intersect and influence one another. But what we're trying to do is that broadening out of options for consideration of the wider set of actors in a place, not just the privileged few. And then we can bring some of those ideas to the consideration of decision makers at local level, at state, federal level, and allow them to hear that different set of perspectives on these possible future pathways. And what I think we can do as researchers is to make the process of decision making, of choosing which way and under what conditions, more transparent, and therefore make the decision making process more accountable. We can't tell them you do this, but we can set out the information, provide insights into who benefits and who doesn't. They can't say they didn't know, is one of the aspects of what we're trying to do with this pathways work.
Right. No, I found a few things that you mentioned over there quite interesting to pick on. For instance, you mentioned a motorway as a metaphor to talk about the pathway. And particularly sitting here in Bangalore, where we see traffic congestion as a big problem, one of the ways in dealing with it could be, and to use the same metaphor, would be to have a flyover or a 6-lane or an 8-lane, a broader motorway to fix the problem between 2 points. That's one kind of
more of the same.
More of the same. Alternatives could be you bring in public transport, you provide a walking path beside it, you provide a dedicated lane for cyclists, and you also mention about the choices people have, and different people would have different choices based on where they come from. These are certainly, I think, important aspects of the pathways approach you described. And another thing you mentioned was about the resilience. So here I was wondering, in this kind of a pathways approach, so where is this pathway or the trajectory leading to? And the other is how you get there, where there could be options. When you approach a challenge and want to employ a pathways approach, are you looking at the future state being climate resilient, or there is an ideal vision? Are the pathways resilient, or is the future state that is resilient?
Well, I think in thinking about different parts of that process and recognizing that resilience is not necessarily a final outcome. It's constantly adjusting to conditions. This is the adaptation and responding to different forms of shocks and stresses, whether they're climate shocks or other sorts of shocks and stresses, that people are constantly adapting, adjusting, modifying practice and how they go about their daily lives and so on. We talk in the climate sector about climate resilience from a capacities perspective. So talk about resilience capacities. And when I'm thinking about these pathways, I'm thinking about how well equipped are individuals and our households and institutions to respond. What sort of capacities do they have to adjust, to shift from that lane to another lane, to be able to adapt to whatever pressures that people are encountering. And obviously all of us are facing certain risks and uncertainties, and it's about navigating those uncertainties and being as well equipped as possible to do that. Part of that is knowledge and information, good science, the sort of thing that researchers can provide, but equally it's about having the wherewithal, whether it's certain economic resources or, as I say, institutional, organizational resources, ways of working that allow people to respond, adjust, and be nimble in those, it's navigating the waves in those uncertain settings. So I see it more as making those constant adjustments than rather a final outcome. We're always working towards things, but the environment is always changing, the context is always changing, so it's responding to those, as I would describe it, and that
Right.
from that climate
Right.
resilience perspective.
Right. No, that's interesting. And you bring in the words of navigation, being nimble, and adjusting a number of times in this conversation. So I guess people are, when being nimble and adjusting is when people are responding to things happening in the environment, some of them intentionally, some unintentionally. And what I mean is that there is market influences, there is influences from policy, there are also things that people are trying. And so there's a lot of experimentation going on. And I've seen in some of your work you talking about a labs approach. So I wanted to bring in this to ask you, how do you think the labs approach fits into this idea of pathways? Do they complement each other, or is there a different emphasis that the labs approach has?
I'll take a step back on the pathways and the work that kind of evolved over the last 15 years or so. For maybe the first 10 years of that work, we were really trying to test this pathways idea in different contexts, or as I mentioned, around the health sector, around the water sector, in food and agriculture. And to give an example, I did work with colleagues in Kenya looking at the lock-in to maize. And maize is the staple food for much of southern Africa. Several hundred million people rely on maize as their staple food. The problem that we've observed is that maize was grown in certain medium and higher potential zones, and we've seen the expansion of maize even into dryland settings, where people are quite vulnerable if their crop fails. And traditionally in those places, people were growing millet and sorghum and other traditional dryland crops, which allowed them to cope in these settings with prolonged drought and the rest. Maize is a kind of an undifferentiated crop in the marketplace. You don't make that much money. It's a good staple, but it doesn't necessarily help generate the income that people need in these smallholder settings. Yet there are alternatives in, for example, horticulture, both tree crops and other sorts of field crops that can actually produce much higher incomes. They're high risk but high reward. And so we were seeing that small producers in these dryland environments were already pursuing alternatives, struggling to make their way out of maize. But all of the government investment, the research and development work, the private sector push was for more maize, and that lock-in was growing. And so what we were trying to do with our partners in Kenya was identify and characterize those alternative pathways out of maize, recognize there were also within maize several options there, that you had this kind of standard hybrid maize that was coming through breeding programs from the government and international agencies, but that required cash to purchase those hybrids and the use of fertilizers and things. And many farmers couldn't afford those on an ongoing basis. And there were traditional forms of maize that came through their practices over many years, and they relied on through seed trading and swapping, and there were other sources of that maize that allowed them to produce maize along with other things, but didn't require as much money to do that. So we were looking at pathways within maize and out of maize. And so by going through that process in different settings, we could have conversations with the producers, various agencies. We brought those insights back to government. We shared farmer perspectives, both directly with those decision makers. We filmed the farmers talking about their efforts to move out of maize and why they needed assistance to do that. And so we were able to do that broadening out and opening up and make the process more understandable to the decision makers who basically were equating maize security with food security. That when people talked about food security at the national level, it was all about maize. And we were trying to think about how you diversify the food basket to make that more resilient to shocks and stresses in the marketplace, as you were describing, but also the environmental shocks and stresses. But a lot of the work we were doing there was interdisciplinary. So we were working with agronomic scientists, we were working with ecologists, we were working with social scientists, and doing a lot of intensive work in the field with different farmers, trying to pursue these different pathways, and with others. And that was great, and we learned a lot, and we shared those insights as I described and documented it through various outputs. But what we felt we were missing is some of the dialogue was, we'd get in, do a lot of the analysis, take the data off, write up the results, present them to those decision makers. And we felt there needed to be more feedback loops in the process, more opportunity for co-design of the research and co-construction of the knowledge, because of course the knowledge was coming from the people engaged in these practices and processes. And so Step Center again at Sussex and IDS, we had adopted some ideas that were coming from a range of different sources around this labs notion, where we were co-designing and co-constructing a research process where they were active partners in the work that we were doing in the data collection, but in reflecting on the results and thinking about what does it mean to them, as well as what does it mean to others elsewhere. And so we called that a transformation lab approach. And so since then, we've been thinking about these ideas in our water work and thinking, how can we employ this as we're thinking about water futures? And through the work with well labs and our partners in Niger and Nigeria and Tanzania, we've been essentially taking forward this pathways concept, but then building it into this transformation labs co-construction process. So the pathways is helping us to think about alternatives and options and possible futures, which is great. But it's the process of co-learning, co-design, co-production of knowledge that I think is the most exciting part of the work we're doing now. And it's not easy, but it challenges us as researchers to think how we make this process inclusive, how we bring people with us through the entire process. So they really own the research, they own the data, they own any choices that are made. And it's not us necessarily coming back and making recommendations to them. Based on our analysis, we found this and suggest that. We're not doing that. It's about us working together and opening up this process to reflect on these futures. But it's up to them then to make the choice about where they go from there.
Dear viewer, if you're liking the Well Lab show so far, you may also like the Water Data podcast with my colleague, Veena Srinivasan. Veena is an award-winning water researcher and thinker and talks to some of the top minds in the world on everything water. You can find all episodes of the Water Data podcast on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts.
Right. No, that's very interesting. And I like some of the out here while trying to describe what the labs approach brings in. And you mentioned about things like feedback and co-design and co-creation, which is what changes it from, say, an external-led kind of an intervention to something which is happening within the lab, and all the participants are part of the process. Also because this is something which we are actively experimenting with in Raichur and in Chintamani, along with you and our other partners within Clarity. And it's something which has to come from within the lab. It's similar to the example of the maize that you gave. And what we are experiencing in Raichur is the rice and paddy cultivation being the dominant motorway. And there are this history and culture of other varieties of millets and sorghum and jowar and bajra and vegetables that used to be grown in the region.
They were traditionally
grown. But then the market is one of the factors which creates a barrier for the diversification, but then also the infrastructure there, which has led to the lock-in many cases. So I like how you also described that there are pathways within maize and outside maize. So here, it is not that a recommendation of you need to move away from paddy. It's not going to be as simplistic as that. There are pathways within that and outside it. So there is a process of.
But how do we improve that paddy production to make it more efficient and more water efficient, shall we say?
Right.
So you can produce more per unit of water in that sort of setting. So that still, is producing that particular crop and making the whole thing more resilient in that place. But then it also releases water for other things. And that gives the possibility of alternatives and the intercropping potentials that can be done in ways of mixing and building on local knowledge and local varieties that people may have used in the past. As you say, a lot of it comes down to market, and that's part of the lock-in, very much so. We've seen that in the maize sector in Africa, where the demand for maize continues to grow, and that's clear. But what we're also seeing is that when people are exposed to alternatives and they start tasting these things and they see the benefits, then there is a growing demand for it. And certainly, and we've seen this in the T-Lab sites here that Well Labs are leading, the horticulture sector has vast potential. It can be very water hungry. And again, we need to think about, well, how do you make this more water efficient while still generating a high value crop or set of crops that can really bring income to farmers and supplement some of the income from those staple crops as well. So it's about, I see it as resilience through diversity, of moving beyond that single crop that is fine maybe one season or for several seasons, but then you get a change in the market, or you get a pest infestation, or you get some other problem that leads to a real shock to the system, and everybody's doing the same thing, and then you get system collapse at that point. But if you get a spread of activities and innovations and practices, it means that you're not going to be overly reliant on the one thing.
Right. And this is all embedded in a research project.
That's right.
Yeah. And that brings me to thinking about when we are trying to come up with these different scenarios of possibilities, talking to stakeholders about what is the possibility space and what are some of the alternatives. On the one hand, somebody could be led to thinking this sounds like a brainstorming exercise, but is there more science to it than just being a brainstorming exercise? Particularly, you also mentioned that a lot of this work is interdisciplinary. So I can imagine there is a lot of integration with the hydrology and the climate sciences. So how much of it how different is it from a brainstorming exercise, and how does it become rigorous, peer-reviewed science also, this kind of work?
Well, I think the aim is to do good science throughout, and that's both physical science and social science, and to combine that with this stakeholder-led process. It's essentially transdisciplinary research. So, but we're also seeing these stakeholders as co-researchers in the process. And so they're involved in problem identification, they're involved in data collection in some cases. We're experimenting, as you know, in Clarity with the idea of community hydrologists, where we're actively supporting local people who have an interest in a certain, perhaps, facility for thinking about water issues and helping to equip them with the skills so they understand their water system and can be monitoring and tracking and doing that sort of real-time assessment and perhaps problem solving on the ground. But equally, they'll have insights that can be shared and brought into the research process as well. And so the idea is to continue to do really good hydrology, really good social science, be able to have those kind of outputs that you would expect from work of that sort, but then combine that through these ongoing dialogues with our stakeholders so that we're bringing back some of this analysis to them to say, this is what we're learning from this process. Allow people to reflect on that, tell us what they think, what we got right, what we got wrong, where we missed certain bits of information. We're talking in Clarity also of taking the pathways that we've done and stress testing them with our climate and hydrologic modeling. So this is taking pathways that are plausible futures, that under certain conditions, this may well be a future pathway, and where there will be investment, there will be policy support, where people will be pursuing livelihoods through that pathway. And so, under certain climate considerations, climate constrained future, what will be the effect on the groundwater system, shall we say, the surface water, on the agricultural production, say in 10, 20 years? Obviously, these are projections, they're possible futures. The modeling is not predicting what the future may be, they're giving us some probabilities, but it allows people to think, if we all go into this with our paddy or other cropping or do these sorts of practices and we're abstracting this amount of water on an ongoing basis, what effect will that have at landscape level? What effect might that have at the household level? And there's lots of what ifs in there, those discussions, but it gives people an opportunity to reflect on that. And something we're pursuing in Clarity and that I've done elsewhere in earlier groundwater work that we did in Africa was to employ this multi-criteria analysis approach. And the idea there, again, is you have multiple framings of the system, multiple storylines from different stakeholders, be they dryland farmers or tail-end farmers, irrigation scheme, or head-end farmers, or the government decision makers or private sector actors. We hear from each of them and invite them to look at the pathways that we've identified through that robust interdisciplinary research and say, what do you think? What criteria are important to you for assessing these? What are their relative strengths and weaknesses from your perspective? And then we take them through a process of applying those criteria for assessing these possible pathways and weighing up their pros and cons, recognizing there are going to be points of agreement and disagreement, convergence and divergence among the different stakeholders. And we try to work with those points of agreement, but also respect the disagreements, the differences, because you're not going to force a consensus when there's such diversity of opinion and values and perspectives. Now, what we're trying to do, and this is where our research for impact, in a sense, comes into the equation, is that we have a commitment to thinking about equality or equity and inclusion, thinking about poverty considerations, thinking about sustainability considerations. So we will, through our process, introduce some of those ideas and invite people to think about the winners and losers, under what conditions, who benefits and who doesn't, and what are the long-term environmental consequences. This is where some of our modeling comes in to help people think about the future, and it will help them to recognize the environmental constraints that they'll be working under given a certain agri-food system and water use practices in a place, what might happen in 10 years, 20 years. And it allows people to, think from different points of view and hopefully find some shared ground, some shared common concerns and agreement. But we're going to be ideally pushing things towards those equity and inclusion perspectives and sustainability angles to ensure that those are kept front and center and are brought to the attention of the decision makers, those who ultimately are making the investments, setting the policies, designing the programs. So again, it's making the process more transparent and accountable. They can't say they didn't know the consequences of their choices.
Liking the episode so far? Hit the subscribe button on YouTube and check out more episodes of the Well Lab show. And hey, share this episode with a friend, a colleague, a student, or a fellow environmental enthusiast who might find this episode useful. We hope to reach more great people like you.
Right. No, I can see that this is quite challenging, and that's where the science comes in to kind of bring in some kind of rigor to the process, but also to ensure that there are all of these elements. Like on the social science side, you mentioned about things like equity and things like differences of opinion. How do you ensure that the voices are heard? But also the fact that you're not trying to force a consensus, but recognizing where there is difference of opinion, but the fact that this is a multi-stakeholder environment, and so there are trade-offs, and then there are this negotiation that needs to take place. And I think this is where the richness of all the social science comes in, but also integrating that with, as you mentioned, stress testing the pathway. So whether it's stress testing with economic kind of criteria or future climate scenarios, more rainfall, more heat, how would this crop or this agriculture pathway perform in a future scenario? I think, yeah, all combining all of this is what makes something like this really innovative and
And that's
interesting.
where it moves from interdisciplinary to transdisciplinary
Yeah.
research, because we are doing this with these stakeholders through the entire process. And the hope is that we'll be building in feedback loops to hear their perspectives, have them challenge us when they think we're perhaps going off track in some way or we're missing something important, and so that we can make course corrections as we go and adjust and improve what we're doing along the way. But we want to bring people with us through this process. We recognize it's not easy, the diversity of views and issues of power, which we have to recognize and address. We have to do it in a very respectful way, but at the same time, we can't ignore it. Recognize that there are people on the margins whose voices aren't always heard, and it's easy to have a range of views brought together and think, oh, we've heard all the perspectives. But we always have to ask ourselves, who's not in the room? Whose voice is missing here? And make sure that we seek those out so that we also get those and that we respect and recognize and give them an opportunity to have their say through the process.
Absolutely. And as the SDG goals keep reminding us, no one should be left behind in the
Exactly.
process. Yeah. You spoke a bit about research for impact. And I think one of your interests is also to ensure that the research is kind of embedded within policy and practice. So I was curious to just get some insights or reflections from you about when you have used this kind of pathways or pathways like approaches in the past. What have been some of your experiences? Are policymakers receptive to such interdisciplinary work? And do you have some insights about what kind of policy impact has this had or potentially it could have?
It's always a challenge because I've recognized that we have to take a certain amount of, we have to be humble as researchers. We're really small players in a much more complex, much bigger situation or system. And so, and often our projects, our research projects may last 3 or 4 years. And even if they build on earlier work, as some of my work has done in around some of these pathways ideas, nevertheless, we have a limited amount of influence, and we can't overstate what we're doing in those contexts. But what we can do is that opening up the conversation and making people aware, including the decision makers, of the implications of those choices. Often there is a blind spot because they're running at a pace, they're working very quickly, they're trying to make decisions on the fly with limited capacity, limited resources. So again, we have to be respectful of the constraints that they're working under, just as we are with small producers, that many of those decision makers are trying to do a good job with all these limits to their work. So what we have to do is recognize and respect those constraints, but nonetheless help them to kind of lift their sights and make them aware of how this lock-in has come about, the implications of that lock-in, and what the opportunities are for breaking out, for opening up some of those alternatives, and then broadening out those pathways that may benefit people and they want to support, but haven't really figured out how they can do that. And so, coming back to a point you made, which I think is really important, we're not saying the motorway, get rid of the motorway. We're saying the motorway is there, but by taking some of the resources, some of those investments, and putting them elsewhere, you can get greater impact at scale for a larger number of people that may be more equitable, that may be more sustainable in terms of the resources, and may be more climate resilient in the long run. We're not saying we can guarantee that, but we can say, based on the best available analysis and evidence that we've done, the good science we've done, combined with all the stakeholder engagement, here's what we can say. And that's coming back to that point about resilience through diversity. It is that broadening out and opening up and broadening out of pathways that allows people to recognize those possible futures and the benefits and disbenefits of making certain choices.
Right. Yeah, and that's something which is easier said than done. So it is a long process that one needs to, like you said, with humility, engage with that process. But it also makes me think about the Clarity project, and this being this also a rather ambitious project with case studies across tropical drylands in Tanzania, in Niger, Nigeria, in Karnataka. And we are having this conversation, of course, at the back of a 10-day long review of how work has been happening across these different transformation labs. And we've had some field visits. So a couple of questions in this regard were, was there something, what was some of the most striking things that you heard in the last week or so coming up from some of these transformation labs in our current engagement? Was there something that surprised you? I mean, what was there, reflections on this?
There's a lot there, and it was wonderful to see and be in the field and see all the great work that Well Labs is doing at the moment with your local partners, government, as well as non-governmental organizations there. What struck me, and it's a conversation that we've been having in Clarity, is the change doesn't wait for our research, that things are already moving quickly and innovation and opportunity is arising. So just as we were talking about, people following these pathways have to be nimble when we're thinking about uncertainties and navigating the future. We as researchers have to be agile ourselves and have to be constantly adjusting and adapting and seizing those moments when a space opens up for maybe bringing in some others into the conversation or making some adjustments to the direction of travel for some of the work we're doing. That's where it really is transdisciplinary. It's that co-construction that's going on, but we're not necessarily waiting for the end of the research to produce our papers, present our results in the formal academic way. It's making those adjustments that I think makes it challenging, but also makes it much more tractable. It makes it much more relevant to the lives of the people, the decision makers, the other stakeholders we're working with. And so we're not saying, wait till we get done,
Right.
and we'll come back and let you know. We're saying, we're in this together, and we're following as much as we're leading this process.
Yeah, no, absolutely. A lot of what you're saying has given me a lot of food for thought in terms of the pathways, impact, connecting research to practice. So it's been really interesting, I think, talking to you about all of these aspects of our work. But before we leave for the day, I wanted to also just ask you, so in terms of your upcoming work and also in terms of what we have planned in terms of this engaging with transformation labs and pathways approaches in Africa and India. Are there a few milestones that you're looking forward to in the coming year? Are there some exciting activities lined up that you want to mention?
Well, we've been talking about all this work for several years. Your director, Veena Srinivasan, and the rest of the kind of core Clarity team, and the vision of what we wanted to achieve with Clarity. And we've had multiple activities going on as we've been developing these T labs, these transformation labs of bringing stakeholders together. We've been thinking about all the science that we're doing on the social and physical side, the modeling, design, and development. All of these have been happening in parallel to some extent, and we've had these moments of talking together and looking at the points of intersection and how they can be brought together in a really integrated fashion. The next year ahead is all about integration. It's all about saying, okay, we've spent the last 2 years laying the foundations, doing all the consultations and engagements. Now it's about saying, okay, what have we learned? How do we bring this together? How do we then finalize and get some agreement with our stakeholders on the pathways characterization in each of the T labs? Then how do we go through that process of stress testing them through our, again, integrated climate hydrologic modeling to bring those back to say, under certain conditions, these are the likely effects when we're following certain practices and water management uses. And then going through that multi-criteria analysis where we're looking at these pathways from the point of view of different stakeholders. weighing up their strengths and weaknesses, reflecting on who benefits and who doesn't, and then thinking about where we might go from here in that process. So the next year is going to be full on with all of this work going on simultaneously, but then trying to come together in a really integrated way and having that make sense to the stakeholders so that it's actually improving their understanding of how systems are changing, what the likely outcomes might be for different types of stakeholders and for the environment, and then having some really critical reflection on all of that with them. And then, of course, coming back to the academic side, we've got a lot of knowledge products that we'll be wanting to produce for different types of audiences, and that too will be running in parallel. So we won't have much time to rest.
Exciting times ahead. And as you've said, a lot of things going on field and in terms of research integration, analysis, and writing up some of this. But I look forward to working with you, John, on many of these things, seeing how some of this transdisciplinary work evolves and continuing to learn, because this is all about co-learning and co-design and co-creation with all the other stakeholders we are engaged with. It's been a pleasure talking with you, John.
Pleasure indeed.
Look forward
Thank you
to
very much.
continuing this.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Well Labs Show. Don't forget to subscribe to the Well Labs YouTube channel and share this episode with your friends and colleagues. Until next time.